Thankfulness. Here we go. So where do we begin? Well, firstly, thank you for joining this session. Thank you so much for just being here today and for being a part of this conference. From myself, it's a pleasure to be doing it, and I'm so grateful that I've got so many people attending, and I hope that in this presentation I can share some of my knowledge. Maybe you guys could share some of your own experiences too, and we'll get cracking. So who am I? You might be wondering, who is this strange man that I've signed up to listen to at 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon? I am James Newman, so I'm the Diocese's digital communications officer. I've been working there for sort of over a year now-ish, and before that I was working at a chaplaincy, St. Peter's House on Oxford Road to the university. And before that I was sort of a bit of a freelancer. I worked at a tech startup in town in digital marketing. So I'm just in general a bit of a geek, love technology, love anything digital. And so that's why it's quite a nice fitting role for me in the diocese. And my role is really to, a couple more people coming in. My role is really to sort of enable people to, or enable parishes and churches and people to improve their own digital presence. Right, and we're going to talk a little bit about that when it comes to communications, but we need to consider how we are communicating the gospel, how we're communicating generosity, and it's my job to enable and support and assist people to do that in whatever way they feel is necessary. And so I suppose this is sort of just another point that if you've never seen my face before, I can support you, your church, your parish in those avenues as well. Obviously the session's all about generosity, but if you feel like you want to improve your social presence on Facebook, or you want to learn a little bit about live streaming, or you want to learn more about Canva as a graphics platform, we do training courses. They're all completely free. I'd be happy to have a phone call with you. My details will be at the end. So I'm just staying on top of people joining if you see me pause, but that's who I am. Less of that and onto the structure for the session. So I think, communicating generosity and thankfulness, really we need to focus on the communication part first. Church communication is so diverse. It's such a crazy landscape, and I think it's changed so much as well. So we'll touch a little bit on maybe that change of landscape in this sort of post-pandemic world. We'll have a little look into sort of defining generosity, if we can, and then what you've all come here for, the communicating of generosity. How do we start this conversation in our church, in our parishes, in meetings, in this meeting, right, in this workshop? How do we communicate it and how do we talk about it? And then a few examples. I have just actually seen somebody join the chat, and one of their examples is used, so that'll be funny when it appears. So church communications. Now it's funny, this slide, because when I first got the job, I had to do an interview, and in the interview I had to make this presentation all about digital church and church communication. So I thought I'd revisit this slide and just talk about communication in general and sort of maybe a little bit of theory about it. So firstly, I think maybe it sounds a little bit cheesy, but I think church, the good news and ministry and the gospel, it's most effectively preached when using the technology of the time, or with the assistance of the technology of the time. Now, if you think of the Apostle Paul, he used any means necessary, boats and roads, to spread the gospel across the Roman Empire. And as we've sort of seen this technology develop over time, ministry and mission has been enabled through its use, from the printing press to radio and now to digital. And this really has an influence on the way that we can talk about generosity, right? It's really important that we recognize that communication doesn't necessarily just mean how we speak. It's how we are, right, online. It's how we communicate ourselves, how we present ourselves in a digital space, how we present ourselves in written format. People, we're creatures of community, and it's really important that we recognize how people are going to interpret what we give them, right? Obviously verbally, but But beyond that, I'm still just admitting a few people. So good to see all these people coming in. So church communications, right? It's just so important and vital that we do recognize the different platforms and methods that we can communicate as a church or as a parish or as a diocese or whatever, right? So communication in a post-pandemic world, you know, I've just given you a few examples there of different platforms that people have used. Maybe in the pandemic was one of the first times that we saw churches spring into this almost digital world. And I think it's a good thing, right? I think as a church, we should be proud of how we reacted. And, you know, it wasn't without cost, which we'll look at, but we should be really you know, thankful to the people that volunteered. And I think it's people look at the church and how we responded, and we responded very well, in my opinion. But communication's changed, right? The way in which we do ministry, the way in which we can evangelize and reach new people, that whole process has changed massively. And it's really important that we recognize that before we start talking about things like generosity. So just 3 points there that I wanted to talk about. Accessibility. So as I said earlier on, I used to work in this digital marketing startup, and part of my role was search engine optimization. This might sound a little bit geeky, but essentially what I do is optimize clients' websites so that they would appear higher in Google, basically. Accessibility is essential because so many people are looking for Jesus, or, you know, they're looking for an answer, and it's really important that we make our resources accessible. And obviously this will play into being generous, because of course it's essential that if people want to be generous, it's accessible and easy for them to do so. As I say, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but it means that our communication and the way in which we communicate has to be accessible, and it has to be engaging. And I suppose what that moves on to is this feeling of oversaturation and burnout. I know I felt it. I'm sure everybody in this chat has felt it at some point. We just suffered so much after COVID, you know, this digital fatigue. And I think so many people are probably still suffering with it, just super burnt out in ways. And it can be quite challenging to keep people engaged and concentrated. And there's so much information out there on the channels. So you're sharing all of this information about your church and the services coming up, and then how do you sprinkle in the idea of, oh, you know, could we have a bit of your money, please? It's like, how do we do this? How do we work that into our communication when it's so oversaturated? Just important for us to reflect on that. And then resources. You know, people are burnt out, so resources are stretched even further than usual. There's almost this 24/7 demand, online and offline, in the building, outside the building, for people's time, people's generosity. There's a demand for that generosity. And in this post-pandemic world, we really need to understand how to manage that and how to, you know, look how we can use that in the most effective way. I like that little quote there. I left that. I wasn't really going to pick up on it, just in case anybody read, but in March 2020, search for prayer surged to the highest level ever recorded. I don't know if that's a really cool stat or it's quite sad, but what it shows is that people are searching, and we need to be present. We need to be on these platforms, and we need to be ready to communicate to them in a way that they can receive, right? The way in which people do receive has changed so much. Let's look at how we can reach those people. So starting the conversation, I suppose what I'll do here is just give you a minute to reflect on the last time that you were generous. That sounds a little bit cheesy, but if anybody could share something in the chat, perhaps a little experience that they might have, the last time that they, or somebody that they know, perhaps it's a project. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Nicola. Yeah, if you could just think back to the last time you were generous. If it's private, don't have to share it, don't worry about it. But feel free to sort of share a few examples of your generosity, or perhaps people have been generous to you. I'll just give you a minute to maybe pop something in the chat, if that's cool. I know you're all generous people. Just get it in there. And I think this, do you know what's funny? This is kind of showing like generosity as well. It's so weird because we're Christian, you know, a lot of people Christians drop large bag of pears off, awesome. I don't know if it's something in like us as just because we're like this British culture of like you don't really talk about it too much, but um even telling people that you've been generous in some ways feels weird because it's like, oh yeah, like look at me, I'm dropping a large bag of pears off at my doorstep, and it's like you almost don't want to talk about it, but then why not? You know, and I think we're going to talk about that a little bit in a little bit in the presentation. But don't be afraid to share these acts of generosity, and yeah, we'll leave people to pop stuff in. Generosity people on pensions buying to fill shoe boxes for Christmas. Awesome, great example. What I really wanted somebody to say in the previous call, somebody said like, oh, I gave £500 to my church, and it's like that's awesome, but generosity and honest gardening and churchyard. Now you're all getting the point that I was going down, and that is that generosity is far more than just financial. People can give in so many different ways. It's not just money. And of course, I'm sure you all sort of assumed this before we did the workshop, but just if you aren't aware, I think sometimes when we talk about generosity and thankfulness, there's always this like stigma that it's just people trying to fleece people and money, and like, how do we get money out of people's pockets and into ours? It doesn't have to be about that. It can be time related, right? In the top right there, that's me. I volunteered at this drive-in nativity that we did at my local church. It was just awesome. So many people giving their time, and I'm sure so many members of this chat just volunteer their time, and you're all giving your time now in ways to do it. And of course, you could go down the line of time is money and whatnot, but people give their abilities. People are in worship bands, people are project managers and they help run cafes and all sorts. That is generosity, right? And if we're to instill a culture in our church, in our parishes around generosity, let's start this conversation by establishing that common understanding, that generosity doesn't have to mean giving more or more financially. It can be about, what it says there. And a little verse from the Bible as well. Generosity is a simple act, and do not forget to do good and to share with others, for with such sacrifices God is pleased. Hebrews 13:16. Cool. It's got a biblical context too. And in a society that sort of revolves around trade and business, generosity can become like really calculative and sort of overcomplicated, but it's simple. And as the Bible teaches that it's simple, and so we should reflect that in the way in which we minister and the way in which we communicate, right? So communicating generosity, it's living a way of life that Jesus calls us to live, and sometimes that can be uncomfortable to say as well. I'm not a reverend or a vicar. I feel like I'm quite new to the Church of England. Actually, I'm quite new to church in the last few years, but it's quite weird, isn't it, saying things like be generous, because culturally it can feel a bit uncomfortable to do it, but sometimes it's quite liberating as well, and it's an enjoyable process. So we want to try and tap into that. So this is the stuff you've all been waiting for, the killer knowledge that I'm all here to share. Do you know what? I'm sure there's some people in this chat that know so much about communicating generosity. I'm just seeing the names, and I just know that there's some people that with some killer experience. So first of all, share stories, right? It's super important that we share stories. One of the stories that I'm going to share in this call that such a good example. Pete Askew. So he works as part of Antioch Church Network, just absolute legend. And he told me that one thing that his church does, which is like this pay it forward scheme. And they do I think he goes into a drive-through at McDonald's or another fast food restaurant of your choice, and he'll pay for the car behind him. And I think gives them like a little card at the door and sort of says, give them, I'm going to pay for their order, however much it is. Could you give them this card? How cool, and sharing that story, well, it sort of has like a two-prong effect. One, it goes, that's an amazing idea, I'm going to use it. and be generous myself in my church or in that project. But it also it just makes me feel good, and it makes the person feel good. It also makes you want to be generous yourself. And so in order to create that conversation around generosity and thankfulness, we need to share the stories of when people are being generous, because that is starting the conversation, and it's creating a culture that people can be familiar with and recognize that it's not always just about money. And it also reflects what happens with that money, right? You know, people might give to church. Where's that money even going? Show them in stories. That's how we do it in the diocese. That's how people do it in churches. Share those stories of you know, positive experiences with generosity. These stories could go a really long way to encourage others to do the same, I think. So tie giving to mission. You know, living by example, outlining a core reason for the need for generosity is just so essential. You know, highlight where the money's going. Be that on like a new fridge for a food bank. You know, highlight the need for volunteers. I was in church the other day, and the reverend was saying about they want volunteers for nativity, and it's going to reach like hundreds of school children. Like, make that really clear and show how it's tied into mission. It's really important that it's not just a request. It's not a demand for money. It's you are enabling us to do these things. I suppose that kind of goes into the last point here, which is generous language. You have to be very careful about the way you say things as well, I think, now. And this isn't just in person, this is online, you know, in and out the church building. Excuse me. The way that in which you shape your message can really influence how it's received, right? Take collection. Yeah, we're going to take collection. You're taking. Why, you know, you could shape that and say we're going to take, or we're going to have our offering now, and it's putting it in their court, right? The ball's in their court. It's their opportunity to be generous. You're not forcing them to be generous. Save our church. You know, don't say save our church. Say, you know, help us to resource our mission. We need support for paying the heating bill. You know, that this is obviously a really big topic at the moment, and it's very, very sad actually to think about, you know, the suffering that people are going to go through in the next few months. And, you know, I think we should all reflect on that and pray about that. But, you know, instead of saying things like pay the heating bill, perhaps it could be enable our church to be a warm and hospitable environment. That's what church needs to be this Christmas and this winter. It needs to be that environment for people. What an opportunity for us to be generous. You know, what an opportunity for us as Christians to be generous. No, there is no greater time than now. Don't ask, don't get. Maybe it's quite blunt coming after what I've just said there, but it's really important that you do ask. You know, it can be a joyous process, and if you don't ask, you're not giving people the opportunity to share in their time or their experiences or their abilities. And sometimes it is important that we ask, and obviously we have to be sensitive about it. But, you know, tie it into that there is a biblical context there. And obviously some people make it very, very close to their faith life. We're not really going to go into that side of things in this talk. But it's important that it's a healthy thing to talk about in church, and people don't always go, oh, here we go, you know, passing the bucket along again. Like, we don't want to worry about that as a fear. You know, it should be something that's positive. It's a positive thing to see. You know, if you're passive with your ask, they'll probably be passive with their generosity, right? Be very clear about what it is that you're asking, and obviously, as I said before, tie that into your mission. I think it probably helped with things like taxation, right? Sometimes you just get taxed and it's like, where is this even going? Maybe if they said, do you know what, James, with that bit of tax, that's going on the pothole outside your house, I'd be like, fair enough. You know, make it clear, make it easy. So make it easy is the next part. Now, ensure that people can be generous should they wish. You know, I know there's some very talented people in this chat that I'm sure could give killer sermons on generosity and thankfulness. and do far better than I'm doing in this call. But you've got all this congregation fired up to give and be generous. And then it's like, how do we do that? We need to enable people. We need to make it easy for them to do that. Could that be digitally? We go back to communication and this digital world that we're now been sprung into. Can we use tap to pay devices? Can we use a QR code that people can scan and give X amount? And then, of course, not just financially, with our time, how can we make it easy for people to give with their time? I was in a church the other week, and they had like these A4 sheets up on the wall at the back, and the speaker who they brought in was talking about generosity and whatnot. And at the end, we were encouraged to go to the back and just sign up. They said, we need your help, like we need your support. And there was like a worship band and house group leading and all this stuff. Just go put your name and your number. Super easy, super accessible. It took me a minute, bang it in there, and it's made me it's given me an opportunity to be generous, right? Of course, embrace new technologies, and be thankful. Be thankful, and you have to congratulate. At the end of the day, gratitude is contagious. It really is, and it's essential to thank consistently. And sure, it might be biblical to give and tithe, and we can go down that route and be generous. But sometimes people just need like a pat on the back. I know I do, and I think a lot of people do. And everyone has their own sort of struggles, and people can be generous in different ways. But I think everyone should be celebrated and thanked for what they do in any capacity, and it should be consistent. And in doing so, you're going to create a culture that is much more comfortable to ask when they're thanked consistently. Sometimes it's quite easy to forget to thank the people that do things around us, but take the seriousness out of that. I don't see a reason why in church people should applaud the person that sits on the desk every Sunday morning and runs that live stream. Clap for them, make them know that they're loved and they're thanked for what they do, and it goes a long way. So here's a couple of examples. I think one of the members of this chat will probably see himself in this example. But here's a couple of cool little examples just before we close up of ways to communicate generosity. So a food bank, that's a pillar of generosity. Food banks and those sorts of projects. I worked on one myself when I was at the chaplaincy, and what we found is a lot of students were coming into Manchester to study here. I think it's one of the most applied to cities in the whole world, Manchester, obviously with the College of Music and Law, and obviously a couple of massive unis. You had all these people flying in, and in the pandemic they had to isolate for 2 weeks. People might not have the greatest grasp of English, they probably had no money, and they had to isolate. They had no food. These people are just starving. It's just outrageous. And people do so much to help these people, and this is one of the projects I worked on. So in the top right there, we did these little parcels, and we deliver food every 2 weeks. And we shared this story like I'm sharing it now, and it encourages other people to do the same, and it starts that conversation, and it shows people where their money's going, because we'd do that, and then we'd say, look, we've fed thousands of students here, and they really need it, but we need your support, and we really need it further. So this is what it enables us to do. I like the food bank one. That was a project that I've worked with these guys, or at least I know people that have. And I like the post. I like the way they've worded it, because they start with appreciation. They start with thanking. Awesome. And it even says they're feeling thankful at the top, right? But they have shortages, and they need stuff. And here's what they need. They're asking, right? We need milk, we need coffee, we need soup. Anything would be appreciated. Thank you in advance. How simple. And you're enabling people to be generous. And it's easily shared on Facebook. They've got a bit of engagement. How good is that? There's the Reverend Paul Monk. Reverend Dr. Paul Monk. And I filmed with Paul. He's in the chat a couple of weeks ago. It's about a week or two ago now. And Paul runs a food pantry in his church. And we went and filmed the story. And the reason why I put that in there isn't just to say about the amazing work that they do. And I'm sure many of you guys in the chat and people watching this video probably do similar projects or have worked on similar projects. And from my side, thank you so much for doing that. But of course, it's important to share those stories. And in a way, that's kind of what I was doing in this video. I want to share the good work that Paul and the team up there are doing in Oldham. And I hope that in sharing that on the Diocese channels, people can see it and maybe like, no, well, actually, maybe our project needs a bit of a revamp. Maybe we need to revisit it or think about how we could learn. Or maybe I want to reach out to Paul and go, how's things working there? Can I help further? Or maybe I see it and go, do you know what? I want to volunteer my time to do that. You're enabling people. You're supporting people, you're spreading the message, you're creating a culture of generosity and thankfulness. You're creating that conversation and making it easy to talk about. And tap to donate, there we go. We spoke about it a little bit further on. I think that's actually in the wall at Sacred Trinity in Manchester, but I know plenty of churches have it. I know the cathedral has it. That was one of the first places I remember seeing it. Accessibility. It goes right back to what we were saying in this post-pandemic world. We have to make sure our communications, our resources are accessible. If people want to be generous, that's like the most easy and accessible way of financially giving to a project or to a church. It's funny because my dissertation at university was all about consumer behavior and mobile technologies. Probably sounds super boring to some people, but I don't think I need to go into how conclusive it is that people find it a lot far easier now to give or to pay at the shops. Just tap in that card, tap in your phone. It's so simple. So why don't we make it simple in church? Why is it not that simple in some places? Obviously cash is king, some people might say, but it's important for us to recognize the ways in which people might want to be generous. Make it accessible for them, make it easy. Use the technology of the time to enable your own ministry and your own mission. And there's just a standard post. I actually saw that today. I was just scrolling through Twitter. I know it's an older post, but I was looking at some food bank images, team down in Wythenshawe. And I know there was a story recently as well about a church giving out school uniforms. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of amazing opportunities for us to be generous. Start that conversation, talk about it this winter. No greater time than now to be generous and start that conversation. Of course, I haven't really gone into the challenges with the financial implications when people don't have that much money. Money's going to be tight. So how do we deal with that? That's maybe one for greater minds than myself. But of course, if we revisit the idea of you can give with more than just your money, you can give with your time, you can give with your experiences. Let's look at reshaping that. Let's look at starting that conversation in our churches, in our parishes, and try to encourage a more positive approach to communication, generosity, and thankfulness. And thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been maybe what you thought.